It's important to note that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is unique among all TRCs in the world. We are the first and only one that has ever been created because of the actions of the so-called victims of harms. It was the former students who, when they were children, had no power, no voice to do or say anything about what was happening to them. And for many, many years, their parents didn't either, because the Indian Act had such restrictions in it that their parents were not allowed to take action, in fact were threatened with jail, and some did go to jail if they tried to do anything contrary to the government and church policies about their children being in the schools. But those laws gradually changed. As of 1960, Aboriginal people in Canada finally had the right to vote in Canada and in federal elections. A number of major Indigenous organizations formed, and the voice of individual and collective Indigenous peoples became a force that could not be ignored, and that had a vehicle to get itself before the Canadian courts. And so that's what happened. The individual survivors, as they're called, and then eventually several together in what became a massive class action lawsuit, the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, came before the Canadian courts and said what happened to us was not right and we need redress. One of the provisions of a massive out-of-court settlement involving the federal government, 4 national churches, the Catholic entities, several of them, the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church in Canada, as well as the Assembly of First Nations and the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami. They all, and of course the legal representatives for the survivors themselves, they agreed to this massive out-of-court settlement, and one of the provisions which the survivors themselves fought very hard for was the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They realized that with an out-of-court settlement, they would never have their day in court, as it were, so there would never be a public record of their side of the story of what had happened to them. Meanwhile, the churches over the many decades, the federal government over the many decades, had kept lots of written records and documentation, so that side of the story, the adult side of the story, if I can put it that way, was well documented and available. But the children's side of the story didn't exist. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission then, first and foremost, created a vehicle for those children, now adults, to tell us and teach us the truthful history from their perspective of what had happened to them as little children, what the residential schools had meant to them, their families, and their own subsequent families, and the kind of connective tissue, if I can put it that way, between what happened to them historically and the reality that we see in so much of Canada today about the challenges that are facing so many individuals that we see on the streets of our urban settings, so many of the communities that are living in the absence of some of the basic and fundamental things that are needed, housing, water, and certainly educational outcomes, but also to provide a platform for demonstrating unbelievable courage, unbelievable resilience, the bravery with which people have come forward and spoken from the depths of their heart and sometimes extremely dire experiences, to be able to say today, this is what I have done, this is how I have reclaimed my life, this is how I am reclaiming my life, and this is what I want our country and our world to learn from this experience.